everybody to this discussion, the new sex education, colonising our children's emotions. My name is Ellie Lee. I'm the Director of the Centre for Parenting Culture Studies at the University of Kent. I feel slightly fraudulent giving the impression that I should take any credit whatsoever for pulling this discussion together or having anything to do with organising it. Rather, I just have the privilege of chairing it because it's actually Alka who did all the work convening this particular panel and asked me to chair it. Thanks, Alka, for the opportunity. I think compared to certainly previous points when I've been involved in discussions about this particular topic area, the thing that's probably most distinct now is the way in which concerns about what's either called the sexualisation of society or the pornification of society have come to play into discussions of sex education. So previously, most of the discussions I've been involved in, the organising principle for the claim for the need for sex education has been much more about issues to do with, for example, teenage pregnancy. Things seem to have moved on a little bit, and this whole area of sex education has become very much wrapped up in this wider discussion. The speakers are going to make their introductory comments going from that way along here, so I'll introduce them briefly in the order in which they're going to speak. Then we'll kick off. They're each going to speak for 5 minutes or so. I'm then just going to ask them if they've got anything they really, really urgently want to come back on that each other's said. But because time's so tight, we're going to more or less go straight out to the audience. So our first speaker is Alka Segal-Cuthbert. Alka is an English teacher, but is also researching her PhD thesis presently in education at the University of Cambridge. Our second speaker is Hilary Kremin, who is a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Education at the University of Cambridge, so another education person from Cambridge, and he's the author of Peer Mediation, Citizenship and Social Inclusion Revisited. Our third speaker is Rania Hafez, who is the founder and director of Muslim Women in Education and is a senior lecturer in Education and Childhood Studies at the University of Greenwich. So you can see there is a certain theme developing here of academics involved in the sphere of education. Our fourth speaker is Biban Kidron. I'm sure some people will have seen her recent documentary on TV. She's a filmmaker and her feature films include Bridget Jones, The Edge of Reason, and Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, and the recent documentary In Real Life, which was a film about teenagers and the internet. And finally, we're going to hear from Michael Rees, who's the Pro-Director of Research and Development and the Professor of Science Education at the Institute of Education, which is part of the University of London, and was the inaugural editor of the journal Sex Education, which you still edit, or you no longer do?
No.
Okay, pass that on to somebody else. Okay. All right, Alka, to start us off.
Okay, thank you, Ellie. I'm just going to sort of plough straight in with a brief definition just to clear up what we're talking about when we talking about SRE, or Sexuality Relationship Education. And this is from the PSHE Department of Education Review 2011. It's actually part of that review, and the part it's from is the Sex Education Forum's response. And they define it as SRE is about the emotional, social and physical aspects of growing up, relationships, sex, human sexuality and sexual health. It should equip children with the information, skills and values to have safe, fulfilling and enjoyable relationships and to take responsibility for their sexual health and well-being. And that's a kind of bit wide and commonly accepted definition of it. And I want to argue why I'm totally against sexuality relationship education. 4 main reasons. First, I think sexual relationships are fundamentally private affairs. I think, like all human relationships, they're developmental and can't have regulated outcomes through predefined rules or procedures. They're not something you can kind of teach in the way you can teach algebraic formula or how to use, the use of alliteration in English, or such have you. I think it requires a certain amount of privacy, and I think the privacy is very scary, particularly today, and that might be something that maybe we might want to come back to. And it might even have risks, and that, again, is a very thorny thing for today's culture, very uncomfortable with the idea of taking risks, even though a lot of people in education say it's all about risk-taking, but then go on to tell you A, B, C, D, E, F, G, why you shouldn't take risks or how to avoid risks. So it's private, and that privacy needs to be maintained for young people, I think, to develop and gain their sense of self, and a wide margin of tolerance, I think, is needed here. Secondly, I'm against it because it puts teachers into the roles of private confidence in matters which really have nothing to do with them, I was speaking here as an English teacher, with our job as teachers. We're undermining and exacerbating an already fraught relationship. I think education should be about public knowledge, not about current received opinions or contested evidence where value judgments are hidden. And I think there's a lot of value judgments in a lot of the arguments that are being put forward today advocating sexuality relationship education. Providing an education based on subjects and public knowledge is part of our adult responsibility to the young, rather than to relocate any anxieties that we have about sexualisation in adult culture into the realm of education and the world of children. Thirdly, I think it's anti-democratic. Contrary to claims, it's not a response to popular demand by parents or by young people. Research, you can read research which way, but there isn't any conclusive evidence, and you certainly don't see people lobbying. The mass is not out lobbying for, Cameron to provide more SRE. I think what we do see are new groups of experts legitimising their positions as experts in training and all sorts of curriculum materials and what have you in this new area. And I think it's quite hard for them to do it positively, because there isn't really a positive case for it to be done without interfering in privacy and all sorts of questions of, parents' rights and authority. So I think what happens is they tend to do it, tends to get justified negatively by inflating a problem or really exaggerating or taking the extreme cases and making out like the general situation. Fourthly, I think if we ignore or break these boundaries between school life and knowledge, or private life and experiential knowledge, I don't think we're doing this because it's a case that we've somehow made a great breakthrough, that there's been a real development in intellectual development to justify this. I think rather what it's indicative of is a shift in fundamental conceptions of how we see ourselves and how we see other adults. So in other words, it's to do with our foundational beliefs. And I think if we take the idea of what I support is a liberal subject-based education, a fundamental belief that underpins that is based upon a positive idea of people as robust, free-willed individuals, when our attempts to do things and have relationships generally have positive or neutral consequences. Yeah, things might go wrong from time to time, but that's not the default position. And in such an education, SRE, sex relationship education, would not have a legitimate place. It's not a public form of knowledge. If you uphold a more therapeutic idea of education, then I think SRE perhaps might have more of a place. But that is underpinned by very different values. It's far likely to see spontaneous acts and relationships as destructive and as harmful. And therefore, you need to kind of intervene and make sure and do all we can to prevent, rather than be a little bit more relaxed, be aware, watch. I'm not saying, just let them go off and do whatever. Don't ever try and intervene. But generally, we go for the widest margin of tolerance, I think. I think the other thing is that it does undermine other sources of authority in people's lives. Grannies, friends, parents generally tend to be posed, again, negatively as incompetent or a source of misinformation, or that they're just too embarrassed to deal with it. And I think that's a pretty deficit idea of people. Just to conclude, against it because it's anti-human, anti-educational and anti-democratic. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Well, in the spirit of this event, I'm going to take the opposite perspective. And we haven't spoken about this beforehand, but I'm going to speak here as an academic and an author, because I assume that that's why I was invited here, but I could also speak as a daughter and as a mother. The area that I wish to focus on is gender, citizenship and the public-private divide. It's relevant to this debate because this is about the purposes of education that's been running for at least 30 years. More specifically, this is about whether the role of schooling is to prepare, assess and credentialise young people to enable them to undertake future academic and economic roles? Or is the role of education wider than that? And if it is wider than that, what else should it include? Should schools concern themselves with reducing social and fiscal inequalities, for example, or with young people's health and well-being? Should they be places of choice, democracy, discussion and autonomy for teachers and for pupils? Or should they be places where subject knowledge is delivered to students, and I use the word delivered advisedly, through prescribed curricula, regulation and high-stakes testing in a climate of accountability and control? Michael Gove is well known for his traditional and subject-based ideas on education, but as far back as 92, John Major stated at the Conservative Party conference, "Let us return to basic subject teaching and get rid of courses in the theory of education. Our primary school teachers should learn how to teach children to read, not waste their time on the politics of gender, race and class." Likewise, on his election to power in 97, Tony Blair famously summarised his three main aims for government as education, 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 reiterating in the Fabian Lecturer in 2004 that he aimed to ensure that the great majority of young people would achieve the kinds of educational outcomes that in the past have been the preserve of a minority, educated at many of the best schools and universities in the world. I'd like to argue that this narrow view of education is restrictive, mistaken and naive in this time of high modernity, and that it's grounded in false ideas about the public-private divide. This false separation of the private from our public spheres, including schools, is damaging to us all. Let us turn for a moment to some statistics. Domestic violence against women continues to be a key issue, with recent British crime surveys showing that more than 1 in 5 women have experienced domestic abuse. Almost half of all female murder victims are killed by a lover or ex-partner. According to a recent NSPC survey, 12% of under 11s, 18% of 11 to 17s and 24% of 18 to 24s have been exposed to domestic abuse between adults in their homes during childhood. Adult males were the perpetrators of 94% of cases where one parent had physically abused another. Boys, we are told, are increasingly confused about sex and sexuality, resulting from early exposure to pornography and an unrealistic idea of the female body. Do we avoid talking about this at school? Do we leave these areas untouched? Shameful issues to be banished to the private sphere of the family, to be silently endured or fed by ignorance. Some loving families perhaps do engage with these issues, but sexual abuse and dysfunctional relations are not the preserve of marginalised groups in society. They are all around us and they affect us all. Ruth Lister, Madeleine Arnaud and others suggest that the public-private divide within traditional concepts of citizenship has resulted in the marginalisation of women from the public sphere and the exclusion of the private sphere from discussion about rights, duties, justice and freedom. Plummer's 2003 concept of intimate citizenship helps us close the divide, challenging masculinist assumptions and rendering issues that have traditionally been seen as a matter of private choice and personal morality as directly relevant to the political world. Sex and relationships are political, and young people need to have spaces where they can reflect deeply on the social and political consequences of their actions. Giddens, in 91, talks about the shifts that have taken place in our times that impact on the way that young people see themselves as social and sexual beings. In these new times, the effects of modernity extend to all areas of personal and civic life, radically altering concepts of time and space in both the inner world of individuals and the globalised world that they inhabit. Authenticity is key. Being true to oneself as one goes through various life stages and transitions is part of a process of creating a personal belief system that forms an all-important narrative of the self. The public-private divide, once so central to concepts of citizenship, becomes less defined. Schools ignore these emerging realities at their peril. Young people are caught in the nexus between the public and the private, constantly required to define and redefine themselves through social media and intimate relationships. They inhabit a world that is hard for those of another generation to grasp. Sex and relationships education, properly conceived, goes part of the way to creating spaces of understanding and resolution.
I'm kind of conflicted a little bit about this topic. I'm actually against sex and relationship education. That's not just because I'm wearing a headscarf, because people think, oh, Muslim woman, she's going to oppose it. Mind you, having said that, when I did put on Facebook, I was speaking at this, unfortunately my mother is on Facebook. She was horrified when she next saw me and said, you're teaching about sex now? I said, no mother, I am not, I'm just talking about it. But having said that, I am more on the side of the kind of the nuances of why, on the whole, it's a negative thing. And I want to kind of draw both on what Alka said and Hilary said. And the first thing is about the fact that it is couched in the idea of a moral framework. And the idea is we want to teach young people about sex and sexuality in relationship within a particular moral framework. But the question is, how do we construct that moral framework? There is a difference between private morality and public morality. And for me, the morality that actually governs sexuality is both, is public and private. Now, the whole purpose of education is to develop a public sense of morality, which is not about what is, personally, who do you jump into bed with or not, or how often, or how you do it. But actually, a broad philosophical idea of what is good, what is virtuous, what are the relationships between people. And actually, I think if we conduct education in the way that develops that public idea of morality, then we are better equipping our young people to look at private areas of morality. And I want to pick up on something Hilary said, which is something about the old generation not being kind of knowledgeable or understanding, or I'm trying to find, can't remember the exact words, kind of in enough to understand the new generation. But then, well, that applies to teachers. The teachers are not the same age as the students. And that's another layer. But in terms of how young people develop ideas about themselves and their sexuality and their personality, again, that's a mix between public and private. And I think we do our young people a huge disservice if we think they're not able to steer and learn how to steer the private and public, especially as we are living in a time of such predominance or proliferation of social media, that they're learning before us how to actually manage this. And the idea of being congruent to oneself, I think that's a pretty dangerous thing. If I had been congruent to myself, I would have been bullied and beaten up several times during my childhood and youth. And I think what young people learn is how to develop the private sphere, hopefully, where there are things that they can keep to themselves and how they develop their role in public. And that's what education should be about. So when we think about managing the private-public divide, well, this is where young people need the private space to do it. And doing it in a classroom is not the right space. And the other aspect of this, so when you think about, I did speak to my daughters last night telling them I'm going to do this, and they disagreed with me. And they said, you were useless at sex education, Mama, you should have had more at school. And I still disagree with them, because I think there is sex education, but it's not by sitting people down and saying, let's teach you about sex, or let's teach you how to be, have your self-esteem protected in a relationship or something like this. There's a hell of a lot about sex education in education, if you take the great literature, works of literature. There is a lot about that there, but it's actually done, and again, in a public, more universal approach as opposed to the individual private approach. There's a lot about it in anything, in biology, in literature, in music. I think sex in that way, as a human condition, as a human aspiration, pervades what we do teach our young people, and how always has done that. But we do it in a way that does not personalize it, that does not make them feel they are on the spot, that actually gives them the tool to be able to contextualize sex in a more global way that will help them hopefully in a personal level. On the other hand, I can see the other side of young people saying, like my daughters, well, you should have done, should have done a better job. But also one of my students last year who, for her dissertation, wanted to look at sex education in Islamic schools for girls. And she was saying it's absolutely useless, there's nothing there. We're learning from other places. And actually, when she looked at it, she realized that maybe it's a good idea there's nothing there. Because had it been from that perspective of that school, they wouldn't have learned that much. It would have been useful for them in terms of negotiating the kind of their position in a modern society where actually teachers and parents are not at with the kids. We can't hold the kids back and say we are going to tell them about modernity. The best way we can tell them about modernity is to give them the broad universals that have been given to us from generations that they can take and they can create their own future with. And I think this is where sex education is. Let's not teach them the particulars. Let's carry on teaching them the great works of literature, philosophy, music and art, and let them use these skills to develop their own world without us interfering in it.
Well, as the only non-academic, I'm going to start somewhere quite different. And it was when I was 14 and I came across a young girl called Jackie crying in the school toilets. And she had inadvertently sat on a warm toilet seat and thought that she was pregnant and didn't know how to tell her parents. Now, displaying the precocious gift for intervention, I started a sex club. And what we were awestruck by was how much some girls in 3A knew about sex. We were also awestruck by the ignorance of other girls who, in spite of having started their periods, appeared to know nothing about vaginas, wombs or babies, and certainly not about clitorises or what is now often referred to as the cunt. It didn't take long for the teachers to become curious about this extremely well-attended lunchtime meeting, and we were shut down. And it was thanks to a rather enterprising biology teacher that she took on the interest that the sex club had ignited, and rather brilliantly filled in the gaps, added a little nuance, and made us understand that while sex could not be taught in a classroom, it was something about which you could be informed. Now, it seems really unlikely that a similar-aged child in 2003 could hold on to that level of ignorance of Jackie. And this morning, just out of interest, I put the word vagina into Google. And I got back Wikipedia, a link to the NHS, several videos examining how to wash away vaginal smells, a heartbreaking account of vaginal cancer, 2 links to X-rated porn, and an article about someone who thought her vagina was haunted. The word orgasm delivered more porn and some particularly unedifying instructions of how to make a woman squirt. Now, some of the opposition to PHSC and its near neighbours, sex ed and SRE, is a sort of conservative, often religious objection to its potential to liberalise attitudes to sex. And it's largely thanks to this group that the government's revised curriculum for science instructs that Year 1 pupils should learn main body parts, but they do not include genitalia. Year 2 pupils should be taught to notice that animals and humans have offspring, but explicitly state that they should not be expected to understand how reproduction occurs. In fact, it is the government's diktat that not until they're 12 or 14, long after most of them have hit puberty, that young people should be taught about male and female reproduction. And in its new guidelines, references to sexual health and contraception have been taken out. Deliberately keeping young people ignorant about their bodies is a horrible sidebar of faith, and a travesty with real-life outcomes for which responsibility lies directly at the door of the current Minister of Education. The opposition to PHSC that's alluded to in the title of this debate by the phrase colonising children's emotions comes from a broader grouping who perhaps might not consider themselves conservative, but appear to suggest that PHSE is the state intruding with its messy and clumsy hands onto what would otherwise be the autonomous space of bodies and minds. What I can't understand about this grouping is their willingness to ignore the other, even messier and cruder hands in the frame, the space to talk about sex and emotion carved out in the early 20th century that, among other things, delivered us the notion of the teenager as a concept, has already been colonised by the empire of commerce. So whilst the vast majority of young people of school age are thinking and wondering and perhaps worrying about sex and relationships, the space in which they're growing up is a school system that for ideological reasons has withdrawn support from PHSE and a relentlessly commercial environment in which all their personal, social and sexual interactions is considered fair game to a free market, where their privacy and the notion of privacy is history. If I was 14 this morning, it is true that I could have come out of my searches with excellent diagrams of the reproductive system and the address of a health centre. But I could equally be terrified about the smell of my vagina and worrying about how I might avoid getting haunted. And having watched a video, as I did this morning, in which two men simultaneously fuck a woman with improbable tits, and instead of inventing a sexual encounter of my imagining, I might be diverted to wondering why my tits do not stand up like that. The discourse about colonising is from those who see the spectre of the state as an offence, and what I see as an offence is the refusal to acknowledge the distorting effects of the free market. The values of advertisers, pornographers, or those who monetize the places where young people are rehearsing their social relationships are a great deal less appetizing than the odd overzealous teacher. In my short-lived sex club of many years ago, Jackie was graced by better understanding of reproduction and no longer worried about warm toilet seats. Another young woman was introduced to the notion of consent, which turned out to be the transforming moment of her young life. I believe that the responsibility of the adult world to the young is to give them tools with which to navigate their journey to adulthood. There is no level playing field to protect, and none of what PHSE has to offer at its best deprives young people of autonomy or their own responsibilities on their journey to becoming adults.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, great to be here. After the range of rather passionate arguments for and against, I thought I'd just make some what seemed to me like quite modest, pragmatic comments almost about what I think sex and relationships education can achieve and what I think are the arguments in favour of it in schools. The first main argument is simply a democratic argument. When you look at surveys of the percentage of parents and the percentage of young people who would like to have sex and relationships education in school, over the last 30 years, you always find in excess of 90% of adults and a higher percentage of young people who'd like sex and relationship education in schools. That doesn't mean it's always very good. For example, I was taught geography and history abysmally, but I am in favour, I'm proud to announce today, of good geography and good history teaching. And in the same way, I'm in favour of good sex and relationships education. The second argument, as well as the democratic argument, is the argument about the consequences of having sex and relationship education, which there is quite a large literature about. Now, what you usually find, in all honesty, is that there are no measurable consequences of having it, because it's not incredibly good. It's not bad, but it's not incredibly good. And quite a high proportion of young people, when asked about their sex and relationship education, say it was a bit mediocre or pretty poor. I learned some things that were useful, but it wasn't as good as I hoped it would be. When it's done quite well, which it is sometimes, the major consequences are to increase the age of first sexual intercourse by about 6 months. So it delays sexual intercourse. It slightly decreases the instance of catching a sexually transmitted infection. It decreases the likelihood of becoming pregnant or becoming a young father, and it increases self-esteem. Not massively, I don't overstate these, but it's nearly always that those are the results when you do get results. The only exception to this is so-called abstinence education in the USA, which when it has an effect, and it usually doesn't, is exactly the opposite of what I have said. It's the only set of programs that makes young people more likely to have sexual intercourse, to have it younger, to be more likely to get sexually transmitted infections, and to be more likely to become young parents. And there's quite good data on that because of the vast amounts of money that the Republican administration put into abstinence education in the first decade of this century. A couple of other points, really. I thought I'd just try and be very pragmatic about what on earth is meant by sex and relationship education as somebody who was a biology teacher and so used to teach in schools. When you're in primary school, what you're talking about usually is, particularly on the relationship end, is simply getting young people to think about what's nice, good, kind, helpful, friendly, thoughtful ways of behaving, relating to other people. As simply as that. Nothing specifically about sexual intercourse, but just ways of relating to other people. I do happen to agree that the latest version of the Science National Curriculum is rather conservative with a small c. I happen to sit on the Science National Curriculum, so quite a few of us on it, we did our best to sort of improve it, and most of you probably won't have seen the earlier versions. But it is a little bit sort of modest. Thankfully, it doesn't forbid, can I make it clear, it doesn't forbid certain teaching. It just says certain teaching that must occur. And good primary sex and relationship education, by the time you get to year 5, year 6, that's when children are about 10 years old, ought to include teaching about menstruation in particular. Secondary education, obviously you get quite a lot of biology education, which is sort of almost half agreed, I think, by one or two other speakers, although not keen on sex and relationship education overall, seemed happy about biology education playing a role. One of the great advantages of being a teacher, as some of you will know, particularly those of you who are parents or teachers yourselves, is you're given a sort of authority by the country to discuss things with young people that can often be quite embarrassing if you're trying to discuss them with your own children. My mother was a very good midwife and nurse. My father was an obstetrician and gynecologist. But I'm afraid I don't think they were terribly good at sex education. And I think in school, I don't think I'm bad at it. And I think that can be quite useful. And saying nowadays I do it more in initial teacher education. And quite a lot of factual teaching will deal with things like the fact this country, although teenage pregnancies are going down, sort of percentages you may know they have for 20 years, we're still one of the highest in Europe. And sexually transmitted infection rates are going up. And the last thing I thought I'd say is that one of the reasons why, I mean, there's always been a need for good sex and relationship education, but without wanting to buy into some sort of naive moral panic about the state of the world type argument, the point is, and Beeban said this probably far better than I can, we are in a situation now where most young people, especially young men, do access a huge amount of information about sex and sexuality, mainly online, in a way that was not possible 20 or so years ago. And a very high proportion of it is completely unrealistic and utterly derogatory to women. Now, you can leave it at that if you want and forbid sex and relationship education taking place in schools. All that good teaching in schools can do is to help provide something of a counterbalance to what otherwise young people are learning outside of school. Thank you.
Okay. Just before we start, could I just see who in the room, as things stand, thinks that there should be sex and relationship education in schools, specifically separate to, say, for example, teaching about human reproduction as part of a biology curriculum or history? Okay.
Yeah, a lot.
So it's probably about, I assume the other people don't. I think that's about half. All right. Okay, I just think we'll go over to the floor for questions and comments.
It's funny, if I was to have heard someone say 20 years ago, you know, the problem with young people today is they don't know how to behave. In fact, they're actually little rascals. And what they need is to be taught how to behave. In fact, they need a good hiding. You'd have thought maybe I'm a sort of reactionary, right-wing conservative. And what's interesting is that the same argument is made that, you know, kids don't know how to behave, but what they need is a good bit of sensitive discussion about their relationships to learn how to be nice to each other. And what's changed is the people making the argument are now not reactionary conservatives, they're sort of progressive liberals. And it's just interesting how that debate has changed. And I'm just trying to understand how we've come to the point where it seems to be more progressive to have this assumption that kids need to be taught how to behave.
First of all, average age of onset of puberty, Victorian times used to be 17, it's collapsed now to 11 and falling. Is it 10 now or even less? That's fact number one. The second thing, the really disturbing thing I find about the whole idea of the insertion of the R word, relationship, as evidenced by a couple of panellists, making what I think were appalling comments. One, a total misrepresentation, fair to understand the nature of domestic violence. The one trying to make out that porn is somehow misogynist. I mean, the problem with the culture we live in, as soon as you introduce relationships into sex education, you immediately introduce derogatory attitudes to males. Male sexuality should be seen as just as valid as female sexuality, but it most certainly is not.
Okay.
It's not seen that way.
Hi, so one thing I noticed about all the panel, you were quite heteronormative, that sex education is about men and women and men and... Well, no, it's just because it never got mentioned about. So this is something for people who don't think you should have sex education and instead you should learn things from family and friends. What if you identify as LGBTQI and none of your parents don't identify as that, none of your friends do? Are you just supposed to either Google things, which is not always helpful, or just sort of fumble along? Because there's certain very, very specific things, like during lesbian sex, if you're sharing toys, you should use a condom. That's not common sense, because when you get told to use condoms, it's usually to prevent pregnancy. So things like that, you will never find out from parents if your parents do not identify as that. So surely schools have to take on that responsibility to fill in gaps that you can't always expect parents and friends to know.
I would be interested as we're going along in other people's opinions on parents and how they sit in all of this, whether they are reluctant, useless, unable to talk to their children about sex.
In response to that then, my parents were very good, always very open and very helpful. But I had friends whose parents weren't. They were very uncomfortable talking to their children about it, didn't talk to their children about it at all. And a friend of mine wasn't worried about getting pregnant from a toilet seat, but was, I'm sorry to say, bullied into having sex with her boyfriend at the age of 14. And I think that if there had been more of a focus on relationships in the sex education, that might not have happened, because it was very biological up until that point, and she was getting no support from her parents. We, her friends, only found out about it afterwards because she had nobody to talk to, and if that's not a reason for having sex education in schools, then I don't know what is.
I'm a primary school teacher myself, and so I'd like to, a few things. The puberty thing, there's a study that's come out showing that, first of all, the number of male partners your mother has determines the age you have puberty. The more they have, the lower age you have puberty. So, why not teach relationships? We're starting to bring in a lot of materials about same-sex couples. While I'm only primary school, it's not going to be putting condoms over toys, but there are steps in the right direction. Up on stage, there was a lot of talk about private versus public. What is private, what is public? This whole forum is about unifying. We bring in parents, we teach them the materials that we're going to be teaching their kids. If they have a problem with that, they have every right to withhold their children from it. And we find that very, very rarely, once they've been shown the material, they hold their kids out. The bottom line is, parents aren't held as accountable as teachers, and they are failing, but teachers with parents together actually provide a front that will build, a positive step forward. And quickly, one more thing, that when I went to school, which was not that long ago, boys were taken and taught boys things, girls were taken and taught girls things. Now in primary schools, it's boys and girls together. You do separate them, so boys won't feel self-conscious to ask questions, girls won't feel self-conscious to ask questions, but they're both learning the same thing, which is why I think this is a big step forward. So we have actually, contrary to what you said, this is a major breakthrough. Thank you.
Can I just ask you, in response to the points that Michael made, which from my understanding of it is what emerges from everything that's ever been found out about sex education, is that it might make a little bit of difference to a few aspects of behaviour, but really it doesn't actually change all that much in a really profound sort of way. What's the basis for your clearly very strong conviction in relation to this? What do you think that you are really going to be able to achieve?
Well, I mean, what's wrong with knowledge? I mean, it's the tools to everything. I mean, there's this big, I mean, I'm sorry, we've got people up here with headscarves on and stuff. Burqas, what are people afraid of? They're afraid of the unknown. When it comes to sex, what are people afraid of? They're afraid of the unknown. We give them the tools, then that takes away the fear, and then that might lead to, I don't know, more positive things. That's my hope, anyway.
Okay, I'm still unclear about what positive things exactly, but I'm sure others will clarify.
Sorry, Kerry Dingle from WORLDwrite, Citizen TV. It would seem to me a bit disingenuous, this discussion, in some sense. It's not a panel on this, but in general, because everything I hear on this really is about instrumentalising sex education. It's never about advancing knowledge, actually, at all. So, you know, you look at it, the horrible assumptions behind this. Young girls are now uniformly, mostly, victims, vulnerable, incapable of standing on their own 2 feet, doing all the fumbling, which can be great, and it might not always be, but why not learn that way? So there's a horrible assumption about young girls being incapable. There is a horrible assumption that, you know, 99% of boys are necessarily predatory. There are horrendous neo-Malthusian assumptions about the developing world, where the idea of sex education is it's going to solve the economy and end poverty and everything else, which is quite extraordinary. And if you look at Cairo +20, which is next year, this is huge and really, really mainstream everywhere and funded by Britain too. And I could go on. There are countless horrible assumptions that we are, without at school being told how to relate to each other, everything's going to go pear-shaped. For me, I don't know what the problems this is supposed to address. I think it's mostly fantastical and hyped, and I think it destroys young people's capacity to stand on their own 2 feet and to work it out. Some have great parents who will be good at talking about it, some have rubbish ones. I'm amazed we've all survived and managed to reproduce, given that apparently without SRE, you know, I don't even know how we have relationships.
Okay, I'm going to take some short comments from the front and then come back out. Michael, do you want to start? Just come back on one thing. So we don't take too much
there are so many interesting points there, it's difficult to know what to come back on. I'd like to emphasise that although I did indeed say that sex education doesn't usually have a huge measurable effect, when it does, to repeat, in this country, it's nearly always positive. I won't repeat all the arguments again. I will say, because I didn't talk about the positive things in primary school. In primary school, it is particularly about knowledge, and it is particularly for young girls about menstruation, because humans do not have an innate knowledge about menstruation. We have innate knowledge about quite a lot of things, a fear of falling, for example, over cliffs. We do not about menstruation. It is very clear, and some of you will know this from your own experiences better than I do, that for some young women, when they start to menstruate, if they don't know what's happening, it is deeply alarming. It is trivial to remove that alarm by teaching, as the primary teacher indicated, usually it's year 5 in this country, precisely because before year 5, fewer on average it depends, fewer than about 4% of young girls are beginning to experience menstruation.
Can I just ask you, would you see that happening as part of a science class? Or?
Don't mind, this is the point, I don't mind,
Okay.
It's up to primary schools.
Biban?
Well, I just hate this sort of, I mean, I agree, all of education's become very instrumental, and I don't think, you know, that anybody who's pro this is actually suggesting that we get a graph and we see how many hours gets one less pregnancy. That's not the point. The point is levelling the playing field so that there are places where young people can, to a degree, you know, have time to reflect and talk to each other and to perhaps an informed source. And we're talking about actually education for education's sake, God forbid, not actually instrumentalism. And I think that, you know, there is a sort of a horrible thing that's happened in schools at both ends. Education for education's gone out of the picture, and so has skills. And actually, if you want to get me on another subject, I'd like them to do bookkeeping too. But, you know, I think the truth is they need to know, and they need to have the opportunity to know.
Okay, Rania?
Okay, the person who said, I wasn't advocating that people learn from friends and family. I never said that. On the contrary, I actually said there is so much in our heritage as human beings in terms of literature, music and art that actually can give you an idea. One of the couple of things, you know, Romeo and Juliet, 14 years old, all the issues around that relationship. A book I read when I was at school was The Scarlet Letter. And it's about questioning the kind of religious morality around sex and sexuality. And as for where they find out, you know, the details about, you know, if you're lesbians, you put condoms on toys. Do you do that at 14-year-olds? You know, do every teachers who started teaching the details about, you know, the act of wherever sex, do they actually remind the students that it is still illegal to have sex below the age of 16 in this country? There are loads of issues around that. And where do we get the information? You know what, a colleague of mine who's the Catholic chaplain at my university was surprised to find out a Muslim young student, Muslim student, put her head around the door a few months ago and said, can I talk to you? And I've got problems, and I'm married, and she went on for about an hour, and eventually I said, well, what are the problems? She said, sex is crap. And so there's a Muslim student who goes to the Catholic chaplain and says to her, okay, I'll give you some advice, and gave her some advice, and 3 months later the student's pretty happy, and apparently she never looked back. So you know what? We, you know, leave it to people to work it out in other spaces, but do not pretend that the curriculum can start addressing the minutiae and the detail of sex, or whereas actually the curriculum can address sex in a far more global way that gives us far more skills to deal with it.
Okay.
Yes, I think I'd like to pick up the way that education has become instrumentalised, commodified, and how it seems that when we think about education, it's about telling young people how to be and how to behave, as if that is what education is about, which unfortunately an awful lot of what goes on in schools is being forced down that route at the moment. But education is a natural process of human development, and as teachers, our role isn't to tell children how to behave, it's to provide opportunities for them to discuss and debate and to learn from each other. We here have the wonderful luxury of this discursive space where we're all learning, developing our ideas. We'll all go away with our ideas slightly changed. That's what we need for young people, not to be told how to act and how to behave. We do have issues of sexual politics in this country. In my view, fathers ought to be pressing condoms onto their sons as they go out to nightclubs and saying, for God's sake, don't get yourself pregnant tonight. That's not what's happening. We're not engaging with men and women about the fact that if a woman gets pregnant, that's a lifetime obligation on a man and a woman to be with that child until they reach the age of 18. We don't talk about that in public spaces. We have a situation where families and girls and women are picking up the pieces of us not having that level of debate about the fact that babies need fathers, and fathers need to be available for their children and want to be. The gentleman was talking about male sexuality. Male sexuality with the men that I know isn't predatory. It's loving, and men want to be there to parent children.
Okay, Elke?
Gosh, such a lot. Well, I think, Hilary, I'll have to go along with the old disagreement here, but I don't actually think education is natural at all. I think, you know, it's natural, we learn, and you know, we learn all sorts of things in spontaneous and informal ways, but education to me is pretty much a very big cultural achievement. It's something people have worked at and contributed to collectively over hundreds of years, and it's very much a conscious endeavour. And I really agree with what Rani was saying about the role of the arts in this, because you see, the thing about public knowledge, and in this case the arts, is that it does two things. It's an introduction to the great things of culture that have been produced, but in the educational relationship where young people are being introduced to this, it does allow them to have that space, that reflective space that I think people do need, but in a safe way, in a private way. So when they are thinking about the problems of Juliet or whichever character they're reading about, they can do it in a way that kind of detaches from their own situation if they want to, right? And they can consider it, from a slightly more objective view. And I would argue that the ability to do that is actually really, really crucial, and being introduced to that is really important. And that will actually allow young people, give people a better basis with which to negotiate the problems and traumas and awful things that happen. Sometimes happen, not always happen, but can happen, and I'm not denying that they do. But they'll be better equipped to cope with it than if they're directly told. The idea of sex education being about a liberating view of sex is absurd, because, you look at what it's saying, it's actually so prescriptive. How you talk to people, how the opposite sexes should meet, when should you, so people become totally internally angst-ridden of, have I been sexist, or could I be a rapist? There's material going out encouraging young boys in particular to analyse their every move, their every word, to see if they might not be, if they're not a rapist, which I think is a horrible thing. What a horrible, horrible thing. For adults to be saying to young people that this is a legitimate thing, a legitimate way to see yourselves, and we think it's a legitimate thing to be doing in schools. I think it's a real retreat from proper education.
Right. Michael, just really quickly, and then Helen, and I'll go over here to this massive hand here.
Well, it was only a quick comment that I was delighted at Rani and Alka's espousal of Romeo and Juliet, because that is precisely one of the ways in which good teachers of English in schools have always taught relationships education. I'm trying to remember, I think Juliet was 13, we're told later on in the play, and that's one of the reasons why the play works well. That is an example of relationship education. You use different literature for younger children, but that's exactly how relationship education can be well taught.
And can I just ask you, do you recognise any of these negative features, or do you just think they're not going on?
This
stuff about the way boys are being talked about.
There are some negative features occasionally, and I deliberately go back to the fact that I wasn't taught geography very well. If you pay enough journalists, you can find in 4,000 secondary schools and 26,000 primary schools some inappropriate teaching in any subject, and therefore I don't deny the specific points that are being made.
I've got a 10-year-old daughter, and I can't think of anything worse than her learning at school about how to put condoms on toys in lesbian sex. Now, the reason I don't want her to learn about that is not that I've got any problem with her having lesbian sex. I don't have any problem with that, although possibly could wait a bit. And not that I've got any problem with her putting, using toys during lesbian sex, if she wants to do that. I've got no problem with either of those things. What I do have a problem with is the incredibly risk-averse idea that you need to put condoms on toys in lesbian sex. Now, I'm not making a facetious point, I'm making an important point, because that really illustrates the point that this is not about facts. This is not, once we move away from the very, very simple biological facts, it's not about facts, it's about values. And my values may be different from what are going to be taught by the teacher in sex education. And that's why I agree with the title of this session, that it is about colonisation, because it is about imparting values. And those are values which should be worked out in the home, in the family, in the private sphere, not indoctrinated, not colonised by teachers. And I think there's an incredible contempt for parents in this debate. I mean, maybe I'm complacent, but I really think that most mums, most dads tell their daughters about menstruation. They tell them about the basic biological facts. I just don't think it's true in 2013 that there are that many children who don't know about that. And the real concern here is not about those biological basics, which most children do know at that point. It's about the worry that parents are not imparting the right values to their children. I think it's very disingenuous to suggest that this is about anything else other than imparting the right values. And there isn't a consensus on that, and I don't want my children indoctrinated in that way.
Okay, over here, Jan McBarry, then I'll come down here.
Well, to add to that point, actually, I think it's also a pathologisation of children and young people and their relationships. And I think this is what's so evident even before they ever talk about sex. So my son at secondary school in the first couple of weeks was taught, had sessions on friendship, and they showed a video on suicide as a result of bullying, a boy who hung himself in the woods as a result of his friends bullying him. I don't think at that point my son had actually entertained the idea that friendship could lead to suicide. And so I think it's extremely ideological, and it's extremely dishonest because it denies its ideology. And I absolutely object to this, not just as a parent, but I think young people should really object to this because you are being told that you are crap. And you're being told that you cannot have sex without catching diseases, that disease is defining what sex is, that you can't have sex without getting pregnant. And actually, most young people do not get pregnant, and most of them do have sex before they reach the age of 20. And I think it's just so poisonous that really young people should stand up to this and say, how dare you assume that we are so toxic to one another? I mean, I watched the Diary of a Teenage Virgin this week, which was the only thing that was remarkable about what seems to be going on with young people is that they're prepared to go on television and say, I'm a 15-year-old virgin, while talking to their mothers on camera about their virginity and how they might lose it. And that to me was the only thing that shocked me, was not that they were watching pornography or that they were concerned to get it over with, get their end away or whatever. The parents were talking about intercourse when really the kids should be having a very long, prolonged period of foreplay probably, which would be their early teens, whereas actually the parents and the educators are the ones that are most concerned that they had good sex and they knew what foreplay was and they knew where the G-spot was and they knew what a clitoris was. Well, you can find that out, to be honest, and most people do. It's not like people live in complete ignorance nowadays because they've got no access to education on this or just information or talking or actually doing the thing that you're supposed to be being taught about. If you just get on with it, you'll probably figure it out. Bodies are not that complicated.
Yeah, going back to the point about the relationship side being very heteronormative, I just think this is a tremendous wasted opportunity because currently in schools, homophobic bullying is still a massive problem. So if you talk about other relationships that aren't just heterosexual relationships and that's it, then you'll make all the children kind of more open-minded and basically better rounded and more decent people and less likely to be homophobic bullies. And also the thing about Romeo and Juliet, I really don't think that the story of Romeo and Juliet, given what happens to them, is a good thing to model a relationship after.
When I was about 9, I used to have nightmares about Doctor Who. When my daughter was 9, she had nightmares about the Childline adverts. And I think that kind of indicates a sort of shift in culture. I have a question for Michael. I'm prepared to accept all the data you put forward on trust about the impact of sex education reducing, but you added to the end a thing about self-esteem, and you said it improves their self-esteem. Now, I have no idea how you measure self-esteem, and it makes me very anxious when I hear educators talking about the self-esteem of my children. The question for all the panel is it possible that an unintended consequence of your attempts to talk about sex in the context of a relationship and self-esteem, most importantly, their sense of themselves, could have the result that it actually makes young women feel more vulnerable?
Hi. Okay, coming from a different perspective, I grew up in the United States without any sex education, from a very Catholic environment, which I very much embrace. I'm a religious person, and I had parents who were very, very open with me about sex and about relationships. And I've seen so many people who've gone through, my same sort of upbringing who could have definitely benefited from this kind of system. definitely. I mean, we were not really taught this kind of abstinence thing until much, much later in our education. But honestly, I think that there are very, very safe environments that you could make with this sort of system. This primary school teacher was talking about bringing the parents into it. I think that if the parents are okay with it and they're saying, yes, this is exactly the kind of thing that I would tell my children or share with my children, they may be more comfortable in this peer environment, talking to a teacher whom they are in their educational system taught to trust, who is their authority figure. Like, you teach me this really interesting subject and you do it well, and you also teach me something about myself. And even though I know that self-esteem isn't really measurable, I don't really know how you would do that, I can't ever see that being something that would be wrong or negative. I see that as only being positive for both men, women, and whatever you identify.
Okay, behind you, Nancy.
I think my worry about this is just that our view of relationships these days is so poisonous. And I think that the thing I worry about is that we are giving kids the message that they can't trust themselves when it comes to sex, and it does have consequences. And I just wanted to bring up the Yale University sexual conduct guidelines, where they have these scenarios where Sydney and Harper are in a relationship. They're thinking about having sex. Harper initiates it. Sydney says this is a bad idea and begins to cry, but then embraces Harper and has sex. And so anyway, this is what Yale says about this. It says the initial consent was followed by ambiguity. Sydney's acquiescence to sex was accompanied by too much dismay to constitute unambiguous agreement, especially given Sydney's long-standing prior refusal to engage in sex. The UWC penalty would likely fall in the range of probation or suspension. I think that the reality is that sex is messy and it is ambiguous. But I really think that instead of instilling doubt about relationships in young people, we should not be treating them like they're incompetent and be treating them as if they have, they know their own minds and they can figure it out. Okay.
Well, I have no intention of handing out condoms to my teenage son as he goes out on a Friday evening, and I have no intention of telling my teenage daughter not to get pregnant. There's a number of reasons for that, but one of which is that I know that if there is one thing that I don't want my children to do, then the best way of ensuring they do it is for me to tell them not to do it. and it seems to me that there is a fundamental failure to understand here how teenagers learn, at least learn about behaviours. And there's a complete confusion between teaching knowledge, which I accept you can do, and learning behaviours, which you cannot teach in this didactic way by either parents or teachers. I just think there's a fundamental misunderstanding there. Now, it's not to say that behaviours aren't important, they are important, but children learn behaviours in a different way. They learn it by lots of different ways. They copy people, they see what people do, and they talk to one another and they find out for themselves.
Yeah, I think one of the problems with this debate is knowing what sex education is. It seems, I'm in favour of sex education if it's the right kind, but very much against it if it's the wrong kind. And the issues that I would take up, I think the idea of prescriptive, this is the way you do it, this is the way you put a condom on or whatever, I think that's entirely wrong. I don't see any place for that because children are highly individual, highly varied, it's a very private, sensitive area. But I do think there's a place for the kind of thing that Beeman described, which is children have questions, they're not sure, they want to understand. And I think if this is done sensitively with a teacher facilitating, so children can talk to each other and learn from each other, as well as learning perhaps from the teacher as well, it can serve a very important function. So I think we have to be clear about what we mean by sex education.
I broadly agree with what Rania and Helen and a few others have said here, but I just, for the sake of argument, talking about SRE, it's interesting that S is put before R in this equation, and actually one thing that wasn't mentioned at all was ethics. Surely if knowledge is a good thing in and of itself, wouldn't it be a good idea to teach children the different kinds of prescriptive ethical, sexual ethical systems and allow them to debate those kinds of things, yes, including natural law, etc. And one other thing, studies show that when parents are most involved in their children's sex education, actually they do better. They don't tend to have as many sexually transmitted diseases, etc., etc., etc. And surely, therefore, teaching parents how to bring that up would be a really good idea. And one final thing, I would ask the panel, do they believe that SRE or RSE or whatever should be prescribed by government in the national curriculum and forced throughout all kinds of schools? Or would they say actually freedom for different kinds of methodologies of RSE in whatever schools, and the kind of debate and freedom for that to take place would be a better model?
Well, I disagree with the condom thing because I know kids are quite creative, but I think it's quite difficult to put it on any other way than the way that exists. And you know, I've not long ago was in state school and there's a neurosis in the education system about teaching things that are not kind of in a way unteachable, but also shouldn't be taught directly, like relationships. And just I'd like to emphasize again, what better kind of way of informing about relationships, just to adults as well as children, do we have on our arts and done Annie Hall and Shakespeare, and so on and so on. And also, if you categorize, you know, make it turn into a subject talking about relationships, and it just makes it boring for the kids. You know, a lot of kids find school quite boring as well, and wouldn't necessarily respond well to that.
So we've got short summings up now, or final points that you want to make, about 90 seconds each.
Only time to say a couple of things. As well as the fairly factual knowledge, which is quite easy if you know the knowledge to teach and is of huge value, as several people pointed out, one also wants to deal with issues to values and ethics and so forth. Various ways of doing these. We've already had use of literature considered. Role plays can be used, discussion with young people. Many teachers are trained precisely to deal with issues where they're either controversial or there's no settled, agreed, definite right and wrong. And that's very valuable to teenagers in particular, because it's much easier to have those discussions managed by a teacher than it is outside of school. The second point is a really interesting one about whether sex and relationship education should be in the national curriculum or not. Actually, more and more schools, particularly at secondary level, are now sitting outside the national curriculum anyway, because of being academies and free schools and so on. So the whole question about the national curriculum in secondary schools becoming less important than it used to. The advantage of having it in the national curriculum is, funnily enough, not so much to do at specifics of schools, but it's to do with training of teachers. You get better training of teachers in subjects that are in the national curriculum.
Okay. Could I just say, because there was a question directly to you about
self-esteem. Yes, I think self-esteem is measured by their validated psychological construct. But it's analogous to what one often sees in the back of magazines and dentists. I feel good about myself. You know, when I'm with others, I get worried. That will be a negative indicator. And you bundle them up, and then you do various statistical measures, and they work very well. They genuinely do at measuring. Self-esteem is about how you feel about yourself, whether you feel good about yourself, whether you feel bad. There can be generic self-esteem, or it can be particularly in relation to things like body image, meeting other people, etc.
It's too broad to put it all in, but I find it remarkable that the people here who have such faith in their kids' ability to just get on and do with it will not support a space like this where they might be able to talk about it. This is a forum that you all find useful. Perhaps kids would find it useful. And I think that the amount of faith that you all have that they don't need any help at all is not then reproduced in faith that they may be able to sort out some of the stupidities that they learn at school. And it will not only be in PHSE, it'll be in other places in school. So I think that we need to show some faith in young people, but right across the board to sort out and not deprive them of access to information that they may actually want.
The one thing I want to say earlier when somebody said about learning from teachers, I was going to say, when did kids actually do what the teachers told them to do? And then somebody else mentioned the kind of reverse psychology. I think that the things that one word has been mentioned yet tonight is this afternoon is resilience. But I'm sure that's part of the curriculum now, the PSHE, and certainly the sex and relationship curriculum is to build resilience. But to me, it's coming out of a space of fear and neurosis. And it's not the fear of kids, it's the fear of us adults, our neurosis. And it's amazing that we made it so far from Adam and Eve without actually getting sex education, and we still managed to reproduce, as Carrie said. There is somebody else in the audience who mentioned ideology, and then there is a kind of a hidden ideology, and it doesn't come out. And it is about a kind of a homogeneous value system that sees us as victims, that actually pathologizes young people and male sexuality, that kind of is trying to be everything for everybody, but in the event does lead to low self-esteem, because it's telling you you can't do it right. You end up being bullied. I worry about 16-year-olds or wherever who are learning about sex, and it'd be surprising that they won't bring out the consent form and get the signature of whoever partner they're going to sleep with before they do it, because this is the message we're giving across. I come back to my original point. Sexuality is a human feature that we've had from dot to now. It is best encountered in a universal public space such as the literature and the arts. I didn't just mention Shakespeare. Some young men that talked about different ethical values, and I was thinking of the Scarlet Letter. And this, given that we live, let's go back to the multicultural Britain, a society where we're going to have different ideologies and value systems. What better than to give our young people a universal ethical framework where they can question themselves, their teachers, their parents and others, and they create a new future that they know about, not our old neurosis and fear.
Well, I think I'll just share one of my favourite quotes, which is, ideology is like bad breath, it's what other people have. And I find it very sad that the way that we think about education in schools has become so impoverished that we can only conceptualise of it as telling young people how to be. And gifted teachers are perfectly capable of celebrating young people's own ability to talk through these issues, to come up with their own ideas, to share, creating discursive spaces like this in order for them to bring what they know, what they think, to test things out and to come to their own personal morality, which is really important. That's not pathologising young people, that's celebrating with them the wonderful life journey of discussion and personal morality.
Unfortunately, SRE does exactly the opposite. I mean, I think the idea of it being a safe public space for people, we're exploring here, why shouldn't we get children to do that? Well, they're children, they're young, we're adults. That's not to say you hide things from them, but it's quite wrong to impose what we're saying here on them, and it is indoctrination. And I think you can tell that it is indoctrination, and somebody said the values are hidden. It's couched in terms of wanting to help and empower children, and I'm not doubting that those are the genuine concerns of people advocating it. But what are we really saying? What are the assumptions here? You see, when we uphold a distinction between private values and sexual relationships being something that people find out on their own, they work out with their friends, with their parents, sometimes with teachers, and I'm not against a teacher it being approached individually and having a conversation, because as part of, a part of a warm relationship that you may or may not have with your teacher. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about introducing it formally as a lesson. There's that, and then that has a correlating public virtue as well. Rani, you mentioned public virtue. The public virtues that we're upholding are those that we can tell the difference between truthful knowledge, public knowledge, and received opinions. We're upholding the virtue of seeing people as being fair, being able to survive knocks and things that go wrong, not just survive them, but maybe even learn from them and move on and even grow from them. We're also upholding an idea of adulthood, that we ourselves see ourselves as being purposeful adults, involved in creating a world, involved in trying to deal with some of its problems, and are not obsessed with what our children are doing, with their girlfriends or boyfriends, and what they, there's more to adult life than kind of, what's between your legs, right? There's an awful lot more, if we can uphold, if we can do that, I think we're actually being far more responsible to the younger generation than by focusing on them and their problems and their, they're going to have problems, right? That's part of being an adolescent. You cannot overcome. You can't just go from child to happily sexually, letting it, having a really great sexual time just like that, right? It's a process. You can only learn through mistakes. So this idea of we teach them how to do it safe at the age of 14, you're not enabling them, you're disabling them, right? Because you're not, even sort of things that are horrible, you're not going to actually empower people, but empower teenagers of that age. I mean, obviously it's a question of judgment as to when you introduce it. I'm not saying you show porn to 9-year-olds, but it's, if you try and kind of immediately rule it out, no, don't screen it off, make just all safe, then how are they ever going to develop any critical faculties themselves? If that just isn't the way. It's such a simplistic monkey see, monkey do model of what people are, and I think that's its danger. And for me, one of the most worrying things was said, I can't remember who, I'm not pointing fingers, but when somebody says to me, I think, it's really important that, teachers are well placed to do this. Teachers we trust, they can teach me about myself. And I think that's rather worrying, right? I wouldn't presume to teach anybody about themselves. I just want to teach them good English.
Okay. I think that was a cracking panel.